Now, as they went on their way, Jesus entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks. So she came to him and asked, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her." Jesus criticizes a woman in her own home while she is hosting him and his disciples. Didn't his mother teach him better? Martha is being hospitable, making a meal, setting the table, ensuring that her guests are comfortable, and instead of gratitude, she receives a rebuke, a mild one, a gentle one, but a rebuke nonetheless from Jesus. And this comes after we just read earlier in chapter 10 when Jesus sends out the 70 to go from village to village proclaiming the good news of Christ. And in each village, he says, rely on the hospitality of those who greet you there. If someone welcomes you into their home, stay in their home. And he says, give them a word of peace, and your peace will remain on them. Yet when Martha asks for a little help from her sister Mary, what does Jesus say? Don't worry about it. What's going on here? The short answer is, there is more to discipleship than service. There is more to following Jesus than doing good work in the world. There is more to being a Christian than showing mercy to those in need. Now, all of these things are certainly part of Christian discipleship, but this story of Mary and Martha remind us that they are just part. They are not the whole thing. The Good Samaritan story from last week teaches us that being disciples of Jesus does indeed mean loving your neighbor, showing mercy even to strangers. But Luke makes sure to put this story of Mary and Martha right on the heels of the Good Samaritan story, just in case we get the wrong idea and think that our works can save us. Our Christian work needs to be energized by our Christian faith. Otherwise, our work becomes drudgery, where we just keep doing things that we think are good and right, but we lose hope that they're making a difference, that they're part of anything bigger than ourselves. And we'll find ourselves exhausted in the end. Work without faith is meaningless. Jesus doesn't criticize Martha for doing the good work of hospitality. Martha's doing an honorable thing, preparing for her guests, being hospitable, welcoming Jesus and his disciples. In fact, Martha is an excellent disciple in her own right. She would go on, as legend has it, to move to France and evangelize the people there, bringing many people to faith. So when we talk about Mary and Martha, we need to be careful not to denigrate Martha too much. She's not a failure of a disciple. But as a disciple of Jesus, and like all of us who follow Christ, she stands to be corrected from time to time. That's part of what being a disciple is. It means we submit to our Lord Jesus Christ, and we invite him to make comment on our lives, on our followership, on how we live out the life of a Christian. We ask him to teach us, to guide us. And when we go astray, we ask him to correct us, and we submit to that. Do you remember what he said to Peter when Peter said to Jesus, "You don't really need to go to the cross"? He said, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have the things of God in mind." To Thomas, when Thomas was struggling to believe in the resurrection, Jesus appeared to him and said, "Do not doubt, but believe." And here Martha needs to be corrected. Not because she's made the wrong choice in being hospitable, but because she expects her sister, Mary, to be just like Martha, to follow Jesus in the same way that Martha thinks you should follow Jesus. Now, I don't know about you, but I often find myself thinking that the world would be a much better place if people were just like me. You ever think that? If they just did the things the way I do them, if they thought the way that I think, the world would be better. I don't actually believe that, but I do find when I get frustrated with people, I'm usually frustrated because they're not doing things the way I think they should be done, the way that I would do them. And I can become very judgmental of fellow Christians when they don't follow Jesus the way I follow Jesus, the way I think Jesus should be followed. That's Martha's sin. She wants Mary to get up and join her in showing hospitality to Jesus and his disciples the way Martha thinks it should be done. Martha wants her sister to be like herself. But Jesus recognizes immediately the mistake that Martha is making and what it would do to Mary's faith. You see, Mary has made a bold move here. She presumed to sit at the feet of Jesus and learn from him in the same manner as his male disciples. She's crossed a boundary here. She's done something that was reserved exclusively for men. And when Martha calls her out for it, I imagine everyone was leaning in, waiting to see what Jesus would do. How would he respond? Would he comport with social standards? Take the cue and send Mary back to the kitchen to do the hospitable work? That's what was expected of women at the time. I wonder if the male disciples were leaning in, already appalled that she was sitting with them as if she were an equal to the male disciples at Jesus' feet. And they were hoping that Jesus would indeed tell her to get up and get to work. And maybe Martha is calling her out because she's trying to keep the peace in her home as she's being hospitable. And here Mary has disrupted things by crossing that line and sitting down to learn like she's a disciple. And Martha is just coming in to clue Jesus in, to give him a chance to save face and get Mary up out of the room and back to work. All eyes would have been on Jesus. Would he let Mary remain at his feet, learning from him? Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted about many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, and it will not be taken from her. Can you imagine the relief that Mary felt when she realized that she was indeed welcome to learn at Jesus' feet? Until that moment, she couldn't be sure that she was welcome. She couldn't be sure that she wasn't intruding, that Jesus wasn't just indulging her, putting up with her until the time came that she would be excused. Have you ever felt like that, wondering if you're truly welcome, if you've been fully included, or if you're just kind of being put up with, if you're being indulged? I remember when my son, Sam, who has Down syndrome, was ready to start school, we were struggling to find a place that would accept him, that would welcome him. We tried a preschool, and the preschool said, we can't handle his issues, you're going to have to go somewhere else. We were in all these conversations with other parents who had children with special needs, and they too would talk about the struggles of fighting the system and trying to get their children welcomed into a school setting. And some of them even won the fight, and they got their child into the school that they wanted, but their child was never fully welcomed, was never fully included, was just kind of being dealt with as best they could. We were in North Carolina, and there was a school down the street that had a special needs program, and we set up a meeting to go sit down with them. And when we sat down with the leaders, the conversation and the tone was so different from anything we'd experienced prior. It was clear not only would they let Sam into the program, but they wanted him there. And they were recruiting him. And they were kind of selling us on how good the program was, and they're hoping that we would place our son there. As my wife and I left that meeting, we were in tears, naming the difference between being truly welcomed and just being indulged. And we enrolled him there. He had a great experience, was fully welcomed. I have to say we've experienced that here at First Lutheran too in the Sunday school program where our son is so well taken care of. Mary was welcomed by Jesus, fully welcomed, to sit at his feet and learn from him just as any other disciple. No distinction. And more than that, she was commended in front of everyone for choosing the better part of discipleship, of listening to Jesus. That will not be taken from her. It is the better part of discipleship. It's true that faith without works is dead. Our faith is meant to be a living and active thing, something we do in the real world, that we live out, that we make a difference. If you were here last week, that's how I ended my sermon, that we would love our neighbor, not in theory, but in real life, in our deeds. But the other side of that coin is that works without faith will leave you empty. And we are tempted to throw ourselves into good works because at least we're active, we're doing something. The world will always praise you for being busy. The world will never praise you and commend you for being still and quiet and learning. We live by that phrase, don't just sit there, do something. But too often our activity becomes like a hamster on a wheel, purposeless. And it loses connection with our faith, and it loses connection with the mission of Christ in this world. As the proverb says, without vision, the people perish. So without faith, our works exhaust us and become drudgery. Paul wrote that in Romans that faith comes from hearing the word of the Lord. Martin Luther wrote that a person becomes a Christian not by doing. A person becomes a Christian by listening. So we too must sit at Jesus' feet and listen to his words and allow his words to kindle up faith in us. We aren't human doings. We are human beings. We are spiritual beings, and we need spiritual food. The words of Jesus are the food that we need, the words that give life to our souls. It's why the disciples wouldn't abandon Jesus when he taught some very difficult things and a lot of people fell away. And Jesus turned to his disciples and said, "Do you too wish to leave?" And do you remember what they said? "Where would we go? You have the words of eternal life." Jesus is the source of our life, of our spiritual life. Like he said to the woman at the well, "If you would have asked me, I would have given you living water." And when responding to Satan in the wilderness, when he was tempted to turn the stone into a loaf of bread, what did Jesus say? "Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the Father." Mary chose the better part because she chose to sit and receive the words of life that came from the lips of Jesus. Our souls, our spirits live on these words of Christ. So we need to discipline ourselves to sit at Jesus' feet and listen to him. And how do you do that? How do you listen to Jesus? How do you allow his word to fill your soul and bring life to your spirit? Worship. Right here and now, worship. We come to worship each week and we surround ourselves with the words of Jesus, with the scriptures and the readings and the liturgy and the hymns and the sermon and Holy Communion where we receive the very word of Christ into our physical beings. All these things immerse ourselves in the life-giving message of Jesus. And when we leave worship, don't we say things like, "I feel better now. I feel filled up. I feel fed." Here we sit at the feet of Jesus. Here we listen. I found myself paying more attention lately to the words of the hymns that we sing. If you've ever led worship, you know that it's a distracting thing to be up front and lead, and sometimes hard to worship. So I have to discipline myself that when we sing, to slow down and pay attention to what the words mean, to what the hymn writer was trying to say, to allow those words to fill me up, to strengthen my faith. You know this. People are attending worship less frequently than they used to. Even here at First Lutheran Church, our worship attendance has been on the decline for about 20 years. I looked at the numbers, and even though our membership numbers go high, people are attending worship less and less frequently and have been doing so for decades. And that's common. It's common across our Lutheran denomination. It's common across the Christian church in America. And I didn't intend to preach this during the summer months when attendance is always low because we're on vacation and moving around. That's good and healthy. I encourage people to take vacation. That's part of that Sabbath rhythm that is important to our spiritual lives as well. But outside of vacation, Christians are becoming more distracted. We're becoming busier. There's so many options out there, so many things to say yes to and to choose that we have this fear of missing out. And so often worship goes on the back burner and we make these other choices instead. But there's a consequence to limiting your spiritual nourishment. And I worry about those who aren't in worship each week because their faith will start to wither. Their lives will become drudgery and exhausting. They will find themselves worried and distracted about many things and unmoored. When we forego worship, we put ourselves at risk. So you are to be commended on this Sunday in July for being here in worship, immersing yourselves in the words of Jesus. We need to sit at the feet of Jesus with fellow disciples and let his words fill us and guide us and shape us and make us into the disciples he wants us to be. And worship is the foundation. It is the central practice of the Christian. But there are other ways to listen to Jesus, not in place of worship, but in addition. Small group Bible studies like the Aspen groups that'll be starting up this fall. Having individual quiet time. When we're in Moab this coming week, we're going to teach the students how to just be quiet and still and listen and pray. We have devotion books that are always on hand for you to take home and read so that you might grow in your faith. All of these are helpful, and we need them. We live in a distracted time. More and more options are open to us about what to do. It will take greater courage every year. It will take greater willpower every year to choose as Mary chose and sit at Jesus' feet and listen. But Jesus issues the invitation to all of us. All the time he comes to us and he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy loads. I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." The invitation has been issued. Let us say yes and receive nourishment and rest for our souls. Amen.